Let's turn now to Romans 14 Unplugged, Feast and Fast and Food, oh my. And we've been going through a study that I put together on my website. It's available for free. And we're going through, let me just park out on this particular section for a second. We're going through these sections. We've been going through these questions, asking questions of the text in this chapter. And we're in this section, who is the brother? And as I mentioned, this section on who is the brother is related to the same question that we asked months ago, who are the weak in faith? And again, let me tell you just right up front, the traditional position on this particular chapter is that the weak in faith are Christian Jews who are part of the congregation that Paul's writing to, but their faith in Jesus is good, but their continued dependency on Torah puts them into a position where many Christians would call them weak. So if you read through your average Bible commentary, ask your average Bible teacher or pastor or seminarian, who were the weak people in Romans 14 that Paul was writing to, you're probably going to be told that they are they are Jewish Christians, or Messianic Jews, what we would call them today, Jewish people who believe in Jesus, but they're still holding on to the Mosaic law. They're keeping kosher, they're keeping the festivals, they're keeping Seventh-day Sabbath, and thus their continued preference for keeping Torah qualifies him under the label of weak. It gives him a status of weak. So it's this category of weakness that's attached to not necessarily their faith in Jesus, but attached to their preference for keeping Torah that gives the strong in the letter, i.e. Gentile Christians or anyone who believes in Jesus but doesn't follow after Torah. It gives these other believers in Jesus the status of weak. And what that ends up doing is it impacts the Jewish person with the idea that I need to change that status and grow up. I need to grow up in the Lord. I need to eventually carry on and move on to be strong like the other Gentile Christians in the group, which means I need to leave my Torah observance behind. I need to let that drop off and drop out of my life. And it becomes a kind of an unspoken, assumption in the group that these weak people are going to grow up someday. But in the meantime, this traditional position goes on to say, let's not fight about this. Let's accept one another where we're at. We understand that maybe I'm speaking as if I'm a Gentile Christian in the group. We understand these Messianic Jews, they came from a lifestyle of keeping Torah before they believe in Jesus. So they don't understand that we're free from the law, that we're no longer under the law, that we're under grace, and that we're no longer under the law of Moses, but we're now under the law of Christ. So we have to kind of give them time to grow out of that old mindset and that old way of thinking and let them grow into the grace of Messiah. Give them time. Don't kick them out. They are believers. They're brothers, right? There's the link to brother. They are brothers. They're believers. So Paul's going to tell us to not judge one another, but to accept one another because God has accepted us because of our position in Christ. So we've got to learn to live with our differences. We just accommodate one another. Let's not look down on one another. But at the end of the day, again, there's this underlying assumption that the weak are expected to leave that Torah stuff behind so that they can grow up in Christ. That's the general way that this passage is articulated to most Christians who read it today. I have a big problem with that general position, not least of which the fact that Paul would consider himself one of the strong, and yet Paul's a lifelong Torah keeper. So there's something wrong with the definition that we're carrying along with the weak in faith and how it's connected to brothers. So let's talk about what are the impacts, what is the impact to our Messianic communities today if we really follow along with the idea that weak in faith are Christians or Jews who believe in Jesus but still follow Torah, and how this is related to the idea of brother. I purport, and I'm telling you this up front so you can understand, I purport that the weak in faith are actually weak in their belief in Jesus, not weak in their faith in God or loyalty to Torah. Their weakness in faith in Jesus is described better by way of understanding that they're still deliberating on who the identity of the Messiah is. They're open to the prospect that Jesus is that Messiah that they've studied about and that they've been hoping for. And they're going to dialogue, these unbelieving Jews of Paul's day, they're going to be dialoguing with Messianic Jews in their communities and with Christian Gentiles in their communities. And prayerfully, they're going to come to a decision that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been waiting for. But until that time comes, they have a faith in God. They're expressing a faith in God, and they're demonstrating a loyalty to Torah. So their weakness is not a position that's designed to be looked down upon per se. Simply, we just understand that they've not come to that decision and made that public profession of faith in Messiah. But they are part of our faith community. And so that's the expanded mindset that we need to approach this chapter with. And how does that play into who is the brother? Well, if the brother is an unbelieving Jew, then it broadens our understanding of who Paul's faith community is. And hopefully, if we have time, we're going to talk about that tonight with this quote from Tim Higgs' book, The Mystery of Romans, or is it The Mystery of Romans I want to quote from? I might want to quote from a different book. We'll see. Nevertheless, let's jump right into, excuse me. Sorry about that. Let's jump right into the study and look at some commentary, some notes from a gentleman that I've been borrowing his notes from for quite a bit here. My page isn't loaded. Apologize about that. Give me a second. My computer's not cooperating. There we go. This is Romans to the churches of the synagogues of Rome. This is Mark Nanos, who is a Jewish author. He's an historian. He's not a theologian, and he's not even a Messianic Jew. He's not a believer, as far as I understand his own profile. But he is a helpful author that's going to help us plug back into the historical context. And he also is able to get into the situation that Paul faced. Even though he's writing from the outside, he's able to plug us into what it would be like to be back in the first century. So we've read some of this last week and the week prior, and we're going to finish the quote from Mark tonight. So let me scroll down to the part that I want to read. Where did we leave off? Okay, here's where I want to read. Okay, this is the final paragraph of the section that I want to read. All right, he's going to describe for us what I might call the impact of changing our paradigm or the way we view Paul. If we continue to read Paul as someone who's championing a law-free gospel for Gentiles and a weakness of Torah for Jews, and the champion of a new religion called Christianity, then it's going to shape the way that not only we read the scriptures, but it's going to shape the way that we interpret and implement that particular viewpoint in our own Messianic congregations, in our own churches. We're going to continue to see that faith in Jesus trumps Torah obedience, to the point that Torah obedience needs to really be something that's falls off, that drops off. It's part of an old dispensation. It's part of a bygone era. It's part of something. It's part of the old that's being transitioned out. It actually feeds into what is known as the replacement theology or supersessionism that's rampant in some parts of the church. Not thankfully and prayerfully, not all parts of the church, Christianity, but it's still very strong in many sectors of Christianity, with this idea that the church, the Gentile church, has replaced Judaism, and Christianity has replaced Judaism, and the church has replaced Israel as the people of God, and the law of Christ has replaced the law of Moses. That's the whole law versus grace argument all over again, where in that little argument, unfortunately for the Jews, they lose, right? It's a zero-sum game. Where only one person wins. That's what we mean by zero-sum. All right, let's read this quote from Mark Nanos, and that'll just give you the idea of what's at stake here. All right, Mark says, Nanos says, what happens if we read Romans anew, based on the presumption that the audience to which Paul addressed the letter met together as subgroups of the larger Jewish community or communities of Rome? Let's just stop and think about that for a second. Instead of automatically approaching Paul's letters as if he's writing to these Gentile churches who are disconnected from Judaism and separated from their Gentile brothers or Gentile counterparts, whatever you want to label, you want to call them, instead of thinking that he's writing to these completely separated groups, what if we were to let history teach us that actually the subgroups of the Christianities, right? We can't even really call them Christianities, but the Gentile believers, the Gentile Christ followers, what if they were actually more connected to the Jewish community, larger Jewish communities than we have been taught? Do the features, Nano says, do the features of Paul's letter make sense when approached from this contextual vantage point? I submit that the answer to that question is yes. Besides avoiding the disapproval and dismissal of the value of Judaism, what might be at risk for Christian identity and guidance, right? How does that impact us as Christians? I know it's a little unsettling and uncomfortable to try and think about it this way, but just follow along with my study for a little bit, okay? In this essay, Nano says, we can only begin to explore why this approach is compelling in view of some of the historical and rhetorical data available, but it is my opinion, granted, as a Jew and an outsider, meaning he's not a believing Jew, he's not a Christian Jew, that the gains for Christians, let me scroll up a little bit, that the gains for Christians, including theological principles and spiritual guidance, will be enhanced rather than diluted when they are no longer tied to, listen to this, the negative binary where we have either or categories traditionally posed in terms such as Christians or Jews, like Christians versus Jews, or Christianity versus Judaism, or Christ versus the Torah, freedom versus obligation, grace versus responsibility, faith versus works, that is deeds and versus and actions, moral versus ritual, spiritual versus physical, and so on and so on. So you understand, let me just pause and interject. The general dichotomy or standard way of approaching Pauline literature is that if we start with the premise or assumption that Paul made a break from his Judaism when he became a Christian, and that he changed his name from Saul to Paul, right? Saul was the Jew and Paul is the Christian, and now he's writing from this vantage point of Judaism is out, Christianity is in, the law is out, the law of Messiah is in, the law of Moses is out, the law of Messiah is in, or the gospel is in. The Old Testament is out, the New Testament is in. The Old Covenant is out, the New Covenant is in. Israel is out, the church is in. I mean, I could go on and on with the binary categories that Nanos is trying to describe for us. And it's all cast in this either-or mindset. Right? As if you could only be a member of one of these groups. You either have to embrace Judaism of Paul's day or you embrace Christianity. You either submit to the law of Moses or you submit to the law of Christ. You either are under law or you're under grace. You're either part of the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. You're either part of the synagogue or you're part of the church. You understand the binary categories. And this is well known to Christianity down through the history, and it still continues on to this day. This is a mindset that unfortunately obfuscates and clouds the way Paul really was writing. We need to let Paul speak for himself and not superimpose anachronistic, that is out of place and time, right? Modern, put back on, overlaid on top of older historical, social understandings of the way Paul was writing. So let's finish Nano's quote here. It's not very long. We're going to start right there. In keeping with Paul's own arguments, Nano says these categories that we're talking about are more realistically approached in terms of this and that rather than this or that terms. You understand what I mean? Paul was a Christian and he was a Jew. Paul embraced the law and he embraced the law of Messiah. Paul understood law and grace. Paul understood Israel's role as the elect and covenant partners, and he understood the grafted in branches, the remnant of Israel, and the church, and their role as the elect part of the people group of God as well. Paul understood the relevancy of what we term the Old Testament, and he understood the relevancy of the letters that are being penned by himself, what would later on be, and along with the Gospels, the stories of Yeshua, that would later be called the New Testament. So Paul didn't have to live in this contest of this versus that right? This or that. And that's a kind of a Greek mindset anyway, a Greek approach where we have a tension between, we have a contest between this or that. Rather, the Hebraic worldview, the Hebraic mindset was well equipped to embrace concepts that seemed somewhat contradictory at times, that seemed to kind of challenge one another, and yet were still both embraced as a this and that, right? Jesus is very God and he is very man. He's 100% God and he's 100% man. Paul didn't have to break Jesus and God apart into two separate pieces to figure out how they worked. Jesus is either God or man. No. For Paul, he can embrace them both. Jesus is Lord and God is Lord, right? The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, and he is a person who can be grieved and lied to. So that's the approach that we're trying to work with. Let's continue with nanos. Emphasis within each category, including binary terms such as these, right, the ones that I just mentioned, will change the given variables of context, time, the participants involved, and so on. But the basis of Paul's beliefs and actions, his concepts of faithfulness to Torah and to Christ, right? Notice not faithfulness to Torah versus belief in Christ, rather both faithfulness to Torah and Christ. These were not conceptualized in a Christianity or Judaism framework. Paul did not have to wrestle with and lose sleep at night over where should my loyalty be? Should it be with Judaism or should it be with Christianity? There was no Christianity like we know it today in Paul's day. We'll read about that here in a moment in the quote from Tim Hegg. Or rather, for Paul, Nanos concludes, those under his influence, surprising though it may seem to many of us today, they were based on a notion that being a Christ follower was the ideal way to live out Judaism in the awaited age to come, which they believed had begun. So as we continue to study through these notes with the material that I'm providing, as well as other authors and we're going to bring in from time to time, then we're going to see that it's going to be much better for us today if we first peel back the layers of misconceptions surrounding Paul, his writings, his letter, his recipients, Paul's worldview, his socio-religious perspectives on things, allow Paul to speak for himself, allow his letters to speak within the worldview that they were written in. That's our interpretive starting point. That's the hermeneutic approach we want to start with. From there, we launch into practical applications for 21st century Messianic churches and communities. Amen? Amen. So that's the better way to look at this. Now, tonight, let's conclude by reading some of Tim Hegg's book. This is from a book called The Letter Writer, and this is available at TorahResource.com, but you have to purchase the book, and I own the hard copy of the book as well, but I've got the PDF pulled up so that we can pull some excerpts from Tim Hegg's book. All right, let's drop down to the chapter 3, Paul's Theology, overview of some key issues, and look how Tim Hegg describes Paul's faith community. We won't read all of this tonight, just maybe a few paragraphs, okay? Let me just read. This is Tim Hegg, starting right here. Quote, "The picture we have painted of the Apostle Paul shows him to be thoroughly Jewish, a Pharisee trained at the feet of Gamaliel, and a dedicated follower of Yeshua, called to be his apostle. Since it is easy in modern times to divorce Paul from the Jewish world of which he was a part, it is also easy to envision Paul within the circle of the Christian church rather than in the synagogue. This is why we must ask ourselves the question of his faith community. We cannot take it for granted that we understand what this was, for if we do, we run the risk of anachronistically picturing Paul's faith community as the contemporary Christian church. The facts are really quite simple. Christianity as we know it in our modern world simply did not exist in Paul's day. There were no buildings with steeples and crosses filled on Sunday for services. What is more, the scriptures that came to be called the New Testament did not yet exist, and therefore exhortations and sermons from the Gospels or epistles were impossible. Worship services consisting of choirs, offerings being gathered, special music announcements, and short homilies by a preacher had not yet been invented. There were no confessional booths, no rosaries, no baptismal fonts, no Eucharistic services. Sunday school, youth group meetings, and single gatherings were unknown. There were no Christmas celebrations, no vacation Bible schools, and no summer camps. No revival crusades were known, nor were miracle rallies or mass healing crusades, something the faith community of the first century experienced. In short, those things that many people would list as characteristic activities and structures of the modern Christian church were unknown in Paul's day. Now, I'm not trying to offend anyone with quoting from Tim Hegg here. What I'm trying to do is help us to get back into the mindset and the worldview of Paul's day so that we can begin to answer these important questions about who are the weak in faith, and is it really possible and indeed probable that the brothers that Paul addressed throughout his letters, they were in fact Christians many times. The context demands that we say that they're brothers. But at other times, the context allows for us to see that brothers includes a larger community that Paul envisioned, where Jew and Gentile, believing and unbelieving, yet both part of what we might call the elect or the family of God, were working together. They weren't always agreeing with one another. Of course, there were differences because of Messiah and other things, ethnicity not being the least of them. But let's continue to let Tim Hegg challenge us with this particular scope of looking at Paul's letters. Tim Hegg continues, if Paul did not go to church as we know it today, what did his faith community look like? What activities characterized the body of believers of which Paul was a member? Now, let me pause again. Paul, I submit, did not feel that he made a break from the larger Jewish community. And indeed, the church groups that he wrote to existed within this larger Jewish community. So, let's keep listening. Tim Hegg says, first, Paul did not consider the synagogue his opponent. How could he? No other valid faith community yet existed, right? I mentioned this a few weeks back. There was no First Baptist Church on the corner. There were no Catholic cathedrals for him to send his readers and his listeners to. There were no Presbyterian churches, no Methodist churches, no Lutheran churches, no Episcopalian churches. There were no charismatic denominations that he could send his groups to. There weren't even any Islamic mosques he could send his groups to, thankfully, right? There were no Seventh-day Adventist churches on the corner. There were no Mormon temples or anything like that. And in his part of the world, there was probably very little, if any, Buddhist temples or any other such Eastern religions that were invading into the Middle East at that point in time. So the point is, from Paul's vantage point and social groups, as we're going to begin to read here, there were basically the Jewish places of worship, which would have been houses of worship like synagogues or just groups gathering together, what we mean by this term synagogue, the Greek word, which means just a gathering of people, houses of prayer, places of worship. And then there were the pagan centers and pagan temples and pagan places to gather together. That was the binary choices that were present in Paul's day. You either worship the one God of Israel, who is the one true God of all mankind, or you embrace the pantheon of paganism that permeated the culture, the Greco-Roman culture of Paul's day. So let's let Tim Hegg keep explaining this to him. While surely there were differences among the Judaisms of Paul's world, the synagogue and Jerusalem temple marked the location of study and worship for all who believed in the God of Israel. Surely the emerging Christian churches embraced the God of Israel. They did not embrace another God, did they? Silence. Yeah, that's right. There were no other gods that Paul was expecting them to embrace. Let's keep reading. Tim Hegg continues, all other temples and places of worship were pagan. So this is the world we have to understand. We should remember that the designation synagogue in the early first century referred most often to the gathering of people, not the building, something I was mentioning earlier. In fact, archaeological data have shown that buildings regularly used by the synagogue were called prosuke, places of prayer, and that private homes were often used by synagogues rather than public buildings. And then I'll read maybe one more section, and then we'll break off, and we'll pick this up tonight. Being the place of prayer, talking about the synagogue as well as the temple, being the place of prayer, we should not be surprised to find the synagogue as the regular place of Paul's worship and study, as well as his entrance into the various communities he visited. Thessalonica, Acts 17, 1-9, Berea, Acts 17, 1-14, Athens, Acts 17, 16 and 17, all hear Paul first in their synagogues. Paul's focus in Corinth was the synagogue, Acts 18, 1-4. Likewise, his focus of activity in Ephesus was the synagogue community, Acts 18, 19 and 19:8. Apollos preached in the synagogue, Acts 18:26. And even the final chapter of Acts relates that the local leaders of the Jews in Rome came together to hear him out, perhaps in their place of prayer, Acts 28, 17-22. And when they respond to Paul's message, it is clear that they recognize the sect of which Paul was a member, not as something outside of Judaism, but as a part of it. We'll stop there tonight with the Romans 14 study. So I'm just giving you this idea that when I talk about the weak in faith being unbelieving Jews, meaning unbelieving as in Messiah yet, but they're still part of this broader faith community that has access to and interaction with both Messianic Jews and Christian Gentiles, it should not sound strange to you. Likewise, when I purport that the brother in Paul's purview at any given time, depending on the context, could include the brother unbelieving Jew who is within the same scope of the listening of the letter as it's being read in a synagogue setting or a home church setting or some setting where we have Jews both believing and unbelieving and Gentiles who are largely believing, but there's still some what we might call God-fearing Gentiles or Jewish wannabes, kind of, people who are attracted to Judaism. I say Jewish wannabe, I don't mean in a bad way, but people who are attracted to the religion of Judaism that we're all interacting together. Don't think it sounds strange, okay? We have to go back to history to understand from the vantage point that Paul's writing. We'll pick this up next week, and maybe we'll conclude it next week. Maybe we won't. I don't want to rush through this part because this really is the background to understanding the instructions that we're going to be reading through when we hear Paul saying, one man picks one day, one man picks another day. Each one should be fully convinced, but don't judge one another in food or drink or things like that. If he's talking about Christianity versus Judaism, well then, yeah, we can see how unfortunately Judaism judged Christianity and Christianity judged Judaism, and it sounds like neither one of those groups really respected Paul's admonition not to judge one another. But if we can understand it from a different perspective, where faith in God leading to loyalty to Torah cannot be judged because that's the starting point towards faith in Messiah, then we can better understand why that judgment is so grievous to each other. All right, that'll do it for the Romans 14 study.